Okay. So perhaps we can get started, and I'm certain as I do the opening remarks, a few additional colleagues will be able to join us. So colleagues, greetings to all of you, and great to have you all online. And thank you for joining us today for this IASC dialogue on the principles for peace. So today's dialogue is really an important opportunity to contribute to ongoing work and efforts by the International Commission on Inclusive Peace to formulate principles for peace. These are meant to serve as a new frame of reference and as a set of standards to guide the meaningful and sustainable implementation of peace processes. So with a record 237 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and protection, which is a 200% increase since 2015, there is broad recognition of the urgency to address the root causes of conflict, which continues to be the primary driver of humanitarian needs. Colleagues, preventing and ending conflicts was echoed at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, and many of you would recall that, and as one of the core commitments of the Secretary General's Agenda for Humanity, specifically calling for a demonstrated, timely, and decisive leadership to prevent and resolve conflicts, acting early to address tensions and de-escalating violence, investing in promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, being inclusive in decision-making, including by involving women, men, young people from all levels of society to foster lasting peace. Yet, over 5 years after the summit, we continue to see an increase in the prevalence, duration, and complexity of conflict. And we continue to see continued violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, with critical protection risks and implications on vulnerable populations, as well as targeted attacks on infrastructure, including school, healthcare facilities, as well as humanitarian workers. Humanitarian action is a feature. It is a symptom of the failure to end and prevent conflict. And while humanitarian action cannot and is not designed to end conflict, there is recognition of the need to coordinate with peace and political processes while standing firm on the need to preserve humanitarian space and humanitarian principles to guide the work of humanitarian action. So colleagues, against this backdrop, I'm truly honored and delighted to be joined today by a distinguished panel to speak to us about the work of the International Commission on Inclusive Peace, to capture lessons and advice from humanitarian leaders on the guiding principles and legal frameworks that govern the work of humanitarian action, and speak to the importance of striking this critical balance between preserving humanitarian space and humanitarian principles while engaging with political processes. I'm extremely delighted again to be joined today, first perhaps to introduce Bert Koenders, who is the co-chair of the International Commission on Inclusive Peace and the World Bank Special Envoy on Fragility. Bert brings more than 30 years of experience in national politics, international affairs and development, and he previously served as Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Netherlands. Prior to that, he served as the Special Representative of the Secretary General in Ivory Coast and Mali. I'm also extremely pleased that we're joined today by Najat Rushdi, who's the Deputy Special Coordinator for Lebanon and Humanitarian and Resident Coordinator in Lebanon. Najat has more than 20 years of experience in development and humanitarian assistance, having most recently served as Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy for Syria and Director of the IASC's peer-to-peer project. Previously, Najat served as Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator with MONUSCA and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Cameroon. Welcome, Najat, and welcome, Bert. I'm also joined today by Yves Dacour, who is the co-chair also of the International Commission on Inclusive Peace and is the Executive Chairman of Harvard University's Edgelands Institute. Yves served as Director General of ICRC between 2010 and 2020 and worked in Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Yemen, and a number of other contexts. He currently leads a special initiative at Harvard University focusing on the theme of security, social contract, and the role of cities at the age of digital surveillance and pandemics. Welcome, Eve. Ramesh, also great to have Ramesh Rajasingham online as well. He is the Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and is the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator with OCHA. Ramesh brings 25 years of experience in the field of humanitarian affairs and with the United Nations system, holding a number of leadership roles, including as Director of OCHA's Coordination Division, and also as the Deputy Regional Humanitarian Coordinator in Gaziantep for the Syria response. And last but definitely not least, lovely to have Hiba Qassas online. Hiba is the head of the Secretariat for the Principles for Peace initiative. Hiba has more than 20 years of experience in humanitarian assistance and international development, having served in various leadership positions with UN Women to advance women's rights and gender equality. Lovely to have you all online, and thanks again for making the time to be part of this important dialogue and this critical discussion. For the colleagues who do not know me, my name is Mervat Shilbeya, and I am the head of the Interagency Standing Committee Secretariat. So as with usual practice, colleagues, we will start with comments from our panelists, and I would encourage you to use the chat box. We're really keen to hear your views, get your advice, your comments, your feedback to inform this critical consultation and this critical dialogue and process for the formulation of the principles for peace. So please take advantage of this opportunity to share your thoughts and, of course, your questions. So perhaps with that, Bert, I'd like to turn to you first. Again, Bert, colleagues, is the co-chair of the International Commission on Inclusive Peace. So Bert, can you perhaps start by telling us a bit more about the work of the Commission and the Principles for Peace initiative? Why is this relevant to the humanitarian sector? Over to you, please, Bert.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the IASC and your leadership to have the possibility to discuss with you really in depth and to hear and listen to all the humanitarian coordinators and others who are listening on a major issue that we are trying to tackle in our commission, the Commission of Principles for Peace. I'm very much looking forward to this debate, a debate, I think, around the humanitarian situation in the world, and more specifically, why, and I'll be very open with you, why we want this debate with you, why the humanitarian imperative is challenged, it's sometimes deprioritized, and what we can do and should do about it. And that after the leadership that you have shown as a commission, the Secretary General, the meetings in 2015. So we're looking at an urgent situation right now, and we would like to make the linkage of this dire situation, especially humanitarian at the moment, to the way we have organized our operations, our missions internationally, our stabilization missions, the way we look at peace, and how we have moved very quickly, in my view, in the last 10, 15 years. I've seen it in my work as foreign minister, as special representative, from a world where inspiration was gathered from the responsibility to protect, the sanctity of the humanitarian imperative, and the debate around neutrality and impartiality of humanitarian aid, although we know it's always been contested in reality, to the reality of today, which is one of proxy warfare, targeting of hospitals, the taxing of humanitarian aid even much more than before, with skyrocketing, in my view, I've never seen that also at the national politician, levels of disinterest. And we better do something about it together. And that's why this hearing with you is so important. The failure that we have seen just recently in the Afghanistan stabilization missions, and I'm not getting into the complex reasons of this, but the tragic ending leading to a humanitarian situation right now at the breaking point, indicates, I think, that the emphasis is now more on migration risks and on terrorist risks rather than on social implosion, the protection of civilians and human security and the humanitarian imperative. So this is at a time that climate change, COVID, where the most vulnerable, as we know, are excluded from vaccination, require us to redefine our humanitarian agenda. And it's, in our view, therefore crucial to be bold in analysis and prescription, and redefine the principles of peace and how to protect the humanitarian imperative in a world of geopolitical and regional rivalry, as well as misconceived stabilization missions, which are faced. I think all of us have seen that. I've seen that at SRSD in Ivory Coast, in Mali, and other places. Stabilization missions with asymmetric threats, often exclusive peace agreements between the military forces, but not much inclusivity, and based on short-term security rather than long-term peace building. Now, in this situation, and I'm not going to take too much time on events that everybody knows around this table very well, but we have made an in-depth analysis about the conflicts that we see in the world right now. There are around 52 conflicts worldwide. That is an all-time high. Close to half of all these conflicts have shown sign of recurrence. And on average, post-conflict peace lasts only 7 years. So in terms of the analysis, it's very clear, and most of us know this unfortunate event and reality, that 35% of peace agreements are not even implemented, including in the country that I've worked for a long time, in Mali. I think almost 80%, maybe slightly less, of commitments made in the Algiers agreement have not been completed. There is a major challenge. I mentioned some of the issues around asymmetric sense, regional rivalries, and so on and so forth. The example of Afghanistan I mentioned, but we could mention very many other instances in Yemen and in the Sahel and so on and so forth. Now, the humanitarian world is dealing with the consequences of this and tries to do what it can. But we all know that the failure of lack of implementation of peace agreements has led to increased humanitarian needs and prolonged conflict violence cycles. And we know by 2030, this is also the analysis of the World Bank, that most of the poverty and instability will be trapped in these conflict states. Now, the failure of many of our missions, and not all of them, let me be the pragmatic idealist, working through the missions and the work we've all been doing in the UN and elsewhere. But these stabilization missions that we're often involved in, we know that they're lacking a lot of results. Look at often the agreements I mentioned, the fact that much of the violence comes sometimes from the same elites that we are supporting in those stabilization missions. And therefore, I think we urgently need a redefining of the situation. Maybe this is the time, an unfortunate time after the failures in Afghanistan and in other places, in a quickly changing paradigm in the world of geopolitics, in the risks towards the universality of human rights and humanitarian law. This is the moment to make I think, a new frame of reference. And this commission that we are leading, where Yves is on and Hiba, we're trying to do this in a global participatory process, really looking very carefully at inclusivity, at pluralism, at what would be the principles for peace, and how we could really make a difference in creating a system of peace building for the 21st century. It's not just words. We do this evidently in terms of based on evidence. We have looked already with Canal Dallaire and others to many different peace agreements. But our goal is not simply to do a new lessons learned. I think the uniqueness is the global participatory process. We have 86 consultations in 8 countries. We do social listening. We are building an alliance of advocates. We have thematic lines of engagement around some of the issues I just mentioned in terms of destabilization and security, around local ownership, around norms and pluralisms, about the values, but also around, I think, what is needed, the incentives, because all of us who know in the reality of Lebanon and other places, it's not just the values and the principles, it's relating those values and principles. which have so many consequences for the humanitarian reality, to incentives, and to a new set of principles. This goes around, of course, issues of local ownership and responsibilities. We are engaging with different constituencies, especially with the youth, with members of parliament, with many women groups and security groups, with religious and traditional leaders, and in the context of a global campaign. And we try to do this based on evidence of what works in the new setting and how we could come to a set of principles. And so we are working on that very much. And in that context, I think the challenge that we have in the humanitarian world is key, because listening to you and how you have been affected, how we have been affected in our work in different countries, being them in the north or in the south, there's also Northern Ireland, other places in the world, could help us further to re-energize an agenda which is really innovative, at the same time takes stock in a very, very serious way about where we are right now, and using hopefully that momentum before it is lost in a lack of interest in a world of geopolitical rivalry that can be very quickly, to a set of principles. And I'm looking very much forward of listening to you, to the humanitarian coordinators, to other colleagues, about how the people who work on the ground in this impartial and neutral way can feed us in terms of what you think should be the proper way of doing things. Thank you very much.
Huge thanks, Bert. And again, alarming, of course, statistics around 52 conflicts worldwide, and interesting also your analysis around how the emphasis is indeed on various types of risks, including terrorist risks, migration risks, but then less so on the risks of social implosion. So really interesting analysis. And again, thanks for echoing the critical point that in the end, humanitarian action actually is dealing with the consequences of the failures in the prevention agenda. Bert, I will want to circle back to you perhaps at a later point during this dialogue. Perhaps if you can also share some of the initial findings or some of the recommendations that you're hearing from the broad consultations that have already taken place around elements that will formulate or form the basis for the principles for peace. So I think it will be really great for us and for colleagues online to get a sense or a flavor of what is emerging from these consultations, if that is okay. And just perhaps with that, I'll turn to Ramesh. Colleagues, again, Ramesh is the Acting Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator with the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Ramesh, great to see you online. So with more than 60 million people living in areas under the control of non-state armed groups, Ramesh, what in your view are the key lessons learned on the importance of humanitarian principles and legal frameworks to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access to meet the needs and protection of the most vulnerable in these contexts? And if I can also complement this question with another one, which is, what do you see as the role and responsibilities of humanitarian actors when it comes to peace processes? Over to you, please, Ramesh.
Thanks very much, Mervat, and also great to see all of you colleagues here, and also thanks for those remarks just now as well, but so very important to hear them. As Mervat, as you've said, I'm here to speak with you and reflect on our use of international humanitarian laws to serve and protect the rights of people caught up in the conflicts that we're facing, be it Afghanistan today or Ethiopia. And over the past few years, I think it's of no surprise to anyone, we've seen conflicts growing, the number of conflicts growing, and lasting longer. They become much more protracted. So consequently, this makes delivering life-saving humanitarian responses even more challenging. Today, as you mentioned, there are more than 60 million people living under the exclusive control of non-state armed groups. There are intractable links between conflict, peace efforts, and humanitarian action. Now, where peace agreements or negotiations fail, humanitarian needs often increase. Probably in almost every case, the humanitarian needs will increase and vulnerability increases. So the humanitarian operations of the UN aims primarily to save lives and protect the dignity of the crisis-affected people. They're carried out in line with the principles of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. And at the root of all of this is probably the most nebulous but the most important principle, which is humanity. And years of experience in conflict situations such as Somalia, Syria, Yemen these days have informed our response and taught us that these principles have helped us gain acceptance and deliver assistance in a timely manner to the most vulnerable people. Obviously, this is not consistent throughout, and you will have many exceptions to that, but some of those lessons have certainly been taken on board. One of the key lessons learned is that non-state armed groups' perception about humanitarian action matters if we want to save lives. A 2016 study by the non-government organization Geneva Call, based on how armed groups perceive humanitarian action, found that these groups felt humanitarian organizations had not engaged with them proactively, or indeed even impartially. The armed groups reasoned that if they had to uphold humanitarian principles all the time, then they expect humanitarian organizations to do the same. And indeed, we have to be that model. And I think that's something we need to remind ourselves every day. Everything that we do has to model that, and we also have to look at the perceptions that are out there. Armed groups also less likely to comply with international humanitarian law and make it difficult for us to access affected people, or even attack aid workers, among other dangerous consequences. However, we seldom engage systematically with armed groups because of counterterrorism measures, legislations, and other factors. And we here at OCHA believe that humanitarian engagement with non-state armed groups must come better informed, more systematic, and more strategic. We need to better understand who we are dealing with and what motivates these groups. But we also need to invest in capacity, expertise, and take the time necessary to sustain the engagement with these groups, not necessarily expecting results immediately, but to establish that relationship and to have a much stronger awareness among these groups of our principles and our neutral, impartial activities. And this is why the Secretary General on the 16th of July asked Martin Griffiths, our Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator, to appoint a special advisor on the preservation of humanitarian space and access, and to strengthen humanitarian negotiations. The IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, is also advancing some of these priorities, and it's developing guidance on engagement with non-state armed groups. We also have the guidance for human coordinators who will be at the front of all this at the country level on the impact of sanctions and counterterrorism measures to help them navigate these sensitive issues. And we have guidance on engaging with entities promoting and working towards peace. Now, member states and donors must also do their part to ensure that counterterrorism efforts comply with international humanitarian law and support a principled humanitarian response. Decades of humanitarian action have taught us that entities that work on development, humanitarian, and peace issues need to collaborate to reduce suffering in conflicts. We are already seeing positive results from such collaborations. For instance, in CAR, in the Central African Republic, peace-building projects not only play a role in restoring state authority and basic services, but also help humanitarian and development programming. Conflicts involving civilians living under non-state armed group control often have their own peace processes. And we need to engage with these processes in instances where there are clear lines drawn between the political and humanitarian agenda. Coordination with these processes is critical as it will help us to maintain our humanitarian principles. And we can also ensure that the peace process helps reduce suffering and enhances people's protection. For instance, peace processes are necessary for the return, relocation, or local integration of displaced persons by the conflict. Durable solutions, in other words. And issues related to missing persons, demobilization of forcibly recruited children, or family reunification can also be, in some instances, part of the peace process. And in these cases, accountability and redress for victims of international humanitarian law and human rights violations can also be a part of peace process. And I would probably argue it's almost imperative that they are part of that. if you want to see a sustainable process or implementation process. And it's essential to accept that there sometimes is or will be tension among UN mandates. So we need to recognize that our objectives are not incompatible. Mediators and other political entities need to also respect and have knowledge of international humanitarian law. They need to understand how the actions could affect our ability to save the lives of the same people that they are also trying to help. And finally, of course, there's no solution like inclusive peace. We must work together to change the narrative to end conflicts. And we really look forward to working with many of the colleagues, panel members and colleagues on this call in furthering this. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Back to you, Mervat.
Many thanks, Ramesh, and critical points as well that you've raised, including, again, when peace agreements fail, humanitarian needs, there's a direct correlation with humanitarian needs rising as a result. But also the critical points that you've raised around the importance of really standing firm and operating based on the existing humanitarian principles and legal frameworks, because that is absolutely key for acceptance and the ability of humanitarian actors to reach vulnerable communities. And perhaps I also want to recognize, good to see Dr. Hani Al-Banna online, and the comment, of course, that you shared, Dr. Hani, around the need for the UN to drastically reform to stop proxy wars. Good to see you online, Dr. Hani. But also the point, again, that Ramesh, you raised around the importance of, while it's critical to coordinate and work closely with peace actors and peace processes, it's important to draw a line between the humanitarian and peace agendas. Absolutely important points that you've raised. And perhaps with that, I'll turn to Najat. Najat, good to see you online again. Colleagues, Najat is a Deputy Special Coordinator and Humanitarian and Resident Coordinator in Lebanon. So Najat, humanitarian action, as we've heard, is indeed guided by the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, as well as by critical legal frameworks, such as international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And ensuring that these humanitarian principles are respected is often challenged by the complex dynamics dominating conflicts and political tensions. So as a humanitarian leader, Najat, of course, you've taken on a number of assignments in challenging contexts. It would be great to hear your perspective as a humanitarian leader in terms of what you think must be reflected in the principles for peace. So I guess it's feedback and suggestions to the co-chairs of the commission that are with us today. Also, what are your thoughts on what humanitarian organizations can and should expect from mediators and peace-building practitioners on advancing the humanitarian imperative? Over to you, please, Najat.
Thank you very much, Mervat, and thank you for the invitation. I have been twice the so-called triple hat, meaning that it's really the typical schizophrenic position where you are part of a peacekeeping and a political mission, and at the same time, the humanitarian coordinator. That said, that's also the position where actually we can really bridge between the different actors. And I am using bridging between the different actors as really one of the requirements and the need actually to really establish a real dialogue and to build trust between the two communities, the peace builders or the peace actors, and obviously the humanitarian actors. And I will say that is really the first requirement, and to really respect each space. I mean, I have been witnessing so many discussion and useless actually arguments between does the political imperative comes first or the humanitarian imperative comes first. I think this is really completely useless. What comes first is the people. And we should not forget about that. And unfortunately, in the middle of our processes, in the middle of our activities, sometimes we forget about that. And let me tell you that sadly, more and more, especially the past years, I feel that people have a bit forgotten about the spirits of the humanitarian principles. And we need to remind them why the humanitarian principles have been agreed and what is their role. Not to say, you know, those are humanitarian principles, halas, you have to deal with it. No, let's also have a bit of educational role to explain also to the others and to educate them about the humanitarian principles. And I can assure you, I mean, all the peace actors or the peacekeepers or the political missions I worked with, they had no clue about what humanitarian principles are about. Of course, they know impartiality, neutrality, humanity, independence, but they don't know actually what it means for them, what it means for us, and why it is there. And I really think that as humanitarian, we should do more of this awareness raising and more of this sensitization vis-a-vis the peace actors. And that is really lacking. And as an HC, I have done it, including with with the NGOs, by the way, and including with some humanitarian NGOs. So we need to remind everybody that whether we are a peace actor, a peace builder actor, a mediator, or humanitarian, our job and our core and the core of our objectives is protecting. It's protecting people. It's assisting people who need it the most, and that's it. I mean, we don't need to go beyond that. And people is not a government. People is not an army. People are those who are really suffering the most, either from the conflict or from anything else. And this is a way to find and to build commonalities, you know, and to stop this divide where you are on the right hand, we are on the left hand, and there is a clear frontier between us. And you know what, guys, we don't talk to each other. It is necessary to talk to each other. So that's the second point. The third point, whether we like it or not, you know, there is the word, at least in the countries I served in, we operate in a very characterized by proxy wars and challenges to the mere notion of state and sovereignty. Really, and actually as humanitarian, we always challenge that. But peace actors and political actors, they don't. So it's really important that we all accept to have the same reading, and we all accept that those are challenging, and then that we set up this dialogue, which will help us, you know, create this space actually for us to work together. Worse than that, and it was very clear for me, in Central African Republic, where I was in a peacekeeping mission, and in Lebanon, where I am in a political mission, lines between private sector and public institutions are blurred. And armed groups multiply and shift their alliances more quickly than we keep up with, loosely or strongly affiliated to states. So, you know, even the notion of non-state armed groups, frankly, I can tell you in Lebanon, it's not true. I mean, let me put it very clearly. It's not true. Criminal gangs, cartels, you know, who are very close to the state and who sometimes are even family members, you know, legitimately, where if you meet in a place, there, it's very difficult for you to do anything, because anyway, they are part of the entourage. So it's really important also to keep that in mind. Worse than that, some world famous categorized terrorist groups are also part of the political sphere. And I can refer in Lebanon to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah being on the one hand the political party and a member of the government and a member of the political elite, but on the other hand, having militia considered as a non-state armed groups and also categorized as terrorists by more than 26 members, you know, member states, which makes it, you know, much more complicated actually for all of us, not only, you know, the peacemakers, but also, or builders, or keepers, I don't know, depending on the context, we keep peace, we make peace, we build peace. But in the three cases, This is really an issue. I have always told my colleagues, whether in UN or the NGOs or whoever member in the humanitarian country team, that as humanitarian, we will sit and speak with the devil if we have to, and if we have to negotiate access and protection. Now, the definition, of course, of the devil, sometimes the devil discusses itself, you know, so it's something we can discuss philosophically, obviously. So what does the increasing divide we now witness between government and their people? And I can tell you, I see that in Lebanon. Notably, those left behind means for the humanitarian. What does it mean for the peacekeeper or builder? How do we maneuver this fine line, especially in fluid contexts where peace is being built with relative success and conviction, and sometimes over decades, and sometimes at the expense, actually, of the people? Just because it was important to come up with a very quick win, you know, and with the peace agreement, because that there was a need for this political gain, but actually very quickly, yes, it completely, broke down and actually led to a worse situation than it was before. And while as humanitarian we address emergency, we still take into account, you know, the fabrics and the ecosystem we are operating in through community acceptance, but also through a very clear accountability to the population and to the people. And to be very frank with you, I would like to challenge and to question the accountability of those who are involved in peace process from the political point of view or any other point of view. So if there is one thing that, you know, the peace principles should definitely learn from the humanitarian principles would be one, inclusion. And I have not seen that happening all the time. Most of the time we talk with political parties, we talk with MPs, we talk eventually with the non-state armed groups, but do we talk to the people? Do we give them a chance actually to tell us what peace means for them? Do we include them in our dialogue? Do we ask them, how do you want to be the architect of the peace in your country? Do we include them in this discussion about what should be the political system that actually would lead to peace? As humanitarian, we have to do it. I can agree with you that we are not doing it the right way. I mean, I'm not saying that we are perfect, but at least we agreed on that. We committed to that, and we are doing it. So that is really something that should be part, definitely, of the peace principle. So inclusion, accountability, obviously, and a reality in reading the situation where sustainability is really about making sure that we are lifting out all those vulnerable from the situation where they are and avoid actually to just run after a quick peace agreement because everybody would like to immediately go to the media and announce it and get all the gains. And guess what? 2 years later, someone else is coming and we come back to exactly the same situation, and even worse, because, you know, when you raise hope and expectations and then it's going back, guess who are paying the price? It's the people. So I really needed to share that with you because I have seen it happening very often. And, you know, let me come back to Lebanon, for example. Hezbollah and the armed groups within the Palestinian camps are the most prominent, armed groups in Lebanon. So on the one hand, Hezbollah is also a political party, okay? And they have, and all the parties, they have different degrees in size and ability to engage in fighting through militia. So as humanitarian, we will talk to everybody. As I told you before, we will sit with the devil if that will help us protect better and access to the population. But then on the political front, you know, if if those are listed as terrorists by the Security Council, or if they are under sanction, or if they are considered as, you know, anything else, how can we reconcile between, in that case, how can we reconcile between what is definitely humanitarian imperative and what is the so-called political imperative? And the reason why I'm saying that is that most of the time we find ourselves with donors asking us, you know, for conditions in terms of not covering some regions because those regions are controlled, for example, by Hezbollah in the case of Lebanon, but in the case of Central African Republic, it was by other armed groups. So how can we actually come again with the peace principle that will again put the people at the center, and that will again put sustainability of peace at the center, and that will again put accountability at the center? I can speak for hours and hours, but I know that Mirbat wants me to be a bit you know, short. So I just would like to conclude, you know, by saying that ultimately, as I said it, and I repeat it again because I'm sorry, I have not seen it happening as often as I would have loved to. It's really about putting the people at the center, but listening to them. I mean, we don't listen only to politicians. We don't listen only to armed groups, because then it means that we listen only to those who have power. And by the way, those who have power, most of the time, they are the reason why there is a conflict, and they are the reason why there is a crisis. So it is important that we give space, and we open the space also for those who are paying the price of whatever is happening, involving them in peace process, but also holding everybody accountable, and to deploy every tool and framework to protect them and to assist them, because it's not easy for them to speak. In peace processes, when there is a political crisis or when there are non-state armed groups, most of the time they will be very scared. So it is our responsibility and our duty, and we do that as humanitarian, and I hope that that will be a peace principles as well, is to create the safe space, you know, for them also to express themselves. It is important that we join up the work of humanitarian and peace actors without, of course, compromising the principles, and especially the humanitarian space. But that implies that we have a common understanding of the context, and that we stop this ridiculous, you know, polarization. No, as humanitarian, I cannot talk to you because you are a politician, or you are a peace builder or whatever. And no, you as humanitarian, we don't talk to you because you guys, you don't understand anything to the political imperative. I can assure you, the humanitarian, they understand very well the political imperative. The politician and the peace builders, they understand much less the humanitarian. So it's important to also, you know, close the gap, at least in terms of dialogue and in terms of understanding. And in understanding the context, is also understanding the risks, but the risks for everybody, not only the risk for the peace process. It has to be all the risks in a comprehensive way, as well as the overall collective objectives of the system as a whole. And critically, it will also require that we recognize that there are distinct roles. I'm not saying we have the same rules, and rules that guide the engagement of each community. And while we all contribute to the collective objectives of decreasing vulnerabilities, our respective contributions differ in ways and intents. It's also about standing our grounds, about values and principles. And it's not only the humanitarian principles. I'm talking about the universal values and universal principles. Because when we come together to a country, I can assure you, they are all looking at us as maybe the only reference for the values and principles. And it's so important that we don't compromise those universal values and principles for the sake of immediate political or peace gain, as in any case, it will never be a sustainable peace. Thank you.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Najat. And I see also comments coming into the chat box, expressing appreciation for the heart and passion that you bring also to the discussion, and bringing it back again, as you pointed out, to people, and the importance of again, avoiding the polarization between the humanitarian and the political agendas and imperatives. So message loud and clear, Najat. And with that, I'd like to turn to Eve. Again, Eve, welcome to the dialogue and the panel. And colleagues, a reminder that Eve is the co-chair of the International Commission on Inclusive Peace, and someone also with significant experience in the humanitarian sector, in the humanitarian field. So good to see you online again, Eve. So perhaps a question directed to you would be great to hear. What are the challenges that you see, challenges and opportunities that you see in harmonizing different mandates and operating principles? This is really building on the points that Najat raised around the universal values, making sure that we don't operate in silos. So what are the opportunities and challenges that you see in that? And perhaps as another question, how can the principles for peace build on and complement and reinforce humanitarian principles? Over to you, please, Eve.
Thank you very much, Mervat. I'm very happy to be with all of you today. I hope we'll have the time to listen, in fact, to the participants and maybe to be challenged. I must say, and I was listening to you, Najat, I feel it very much like you do. And I'm coming from a humanitarian perspective. And I must recognize, maybe, Najat, I was part of these people who were always a bit nervous about, let's say, peace building effort, right? Maybe I didn't understand them very well. I also felt that there was a way to bring peace to context, and especially to conflict, that were somewhat, how can I say, problematic somewhat to deal with, right? I'm thinking about stabilization effort, for example, which were absolutely not inclusive, that made things and relationship with humanitarian very complex. So I must recognize that I'm learning a lot right now. I'm co-chairing together with Bert and other colleagues, and I'm working with Iba, and I think it's an interesting lessons learned. And Bert mentioned time is really ripe. So it's also interesting to try to find where do we see convergence, and maybe not just to build on our differences. I totally agree with Ramesh about, let's be clear that there are differences, and we need to see differences between the agenda, the peace agenda, the humanitarian agenda. But what I just would like to propose is one or two observations and reflections about where do we maybe have convergence. And maybe the first thing is just to recognize, and Mevat, let's agree that we should not start to even worry about harmonizing our different mandate and operating principle. That sounds like, if I may say, the grand bargain 2.0, right? And I know how difficult it is. So I think we should much more try to see where there are synergies. And I would say they are, and we need to explore them possibly. First one, and we've heard that, we are operating in a very same context, right? Being humanitarian development and somewhat peace actors. And we know, and we are struggling with the fact that most of the contexts in which we operate are so-called protracted contexts, right? Protracted conflict. And I see how much the humanitarian, the development actors are trying hard to think beyond, let's say, the emergency, to try even to plan and to strategically reflect about sustainability. I still feel there's a lot to do, including when it comes to peace actors. I still feel that we are somewhat stuck in our very short-term mandate. And let's be very honest, also very short-term funding and very short-term support. So there's really something where we can see as a collective, reflect a much more, how can I say, sustain and long-term approach when it comes to conflict. No surprise here, we know it. But I still feel, and I'm amazed when I'm hearing right now about peace actors, this is new for me, how much still today people are sometimes looking at very short-term mandate, and they design, in fact, the peace building when they do peace building or peace operating, in fact, through sometimes a very short mandate because, or a short time frame, because there is just not the funding to be able to think 5 or 10 years, right? I think there is really something about, nothing new, but we need to push the questions of long-term, protracted, and have then the means to be able to plan, to design, and to think about it. So that's really one point which is really critical. The point too, Ramesh and Najat just brought it, but it's so obvious, is the fact that what should somewhat unite us, if we, or at least bring cohesion in our reflections, are the needs of the people. Their humanitarian needs, I would say, and maybe their societal needs. And you mentioned that should be central, much more than our mandate, right? And I think we know it, and we know that their needs do not fit neatly into our development, humanitarian, and peace building silo, right, at all. So I think there is a need, it's not a surprise again, but to be able to understand what are we trying to do, how can we ensure, and here it's true, the peace builder, the peace actors, the development and humanitarian, ensure that the people get the aid, the support that they need without creating dependencies, but on the contrary, empowering who will carry out the work in the long terms. And no surprise again, empowering, in fact, the local actors. I think we know it. This is a very common challenge, but it's important to mention that. I think the third and I think the last comment I would like to do is really, I think we should really have a hard look at what drive incentive and behavior in our sectors. What really incentivize peace? What incentivize some concrete response? And it's interesting when you're coming into the peace world, or what you see, it's very clear that there is an obsession, and sometimes you can understand when it comes about cessation of hostilities, right? When you are conflict, somewhat the peace sometimes is limited towards, and all the energy goes towards a cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire. And by doing that, what we see over and over is that the ceasefire then becomes, in fact, the peace agreement. And that stops here without really have the energy to then think long terms, to bring in fact, the informal, but also the formal systems that normally is critical if we want to bring the society, if you want to have a clear peace. So there is really something about moving beyond violence as a currency. And there is really something, you mentioned, Bert, you mentioned Afghanistan. It's a very good example, right? Who was around the table in order to be able to discuss peace? How did we bring the society along? What happens over the last 20 years of so-called stabilization efforts? So I think there is a lot to learn about that. And you asked me, Mevat, can we see some connections or maybe some harmonization or maybe even more some synergy between humanitarian principle and principle for peace? I see a lot of them. And let me give you two examples. One is, of course, humanity. That remains for me still the most critical humanitarian principle. And of course, when you want to reflect about peace for principle for peace, the humanity is an absolutely critical element, which is, it's obvious, but it's really about creating and contributing to a very much more peaceful, inclusive, and resilient society. And I really think that is something that can really unite us in terms of contribution. So I think there is a very strong element around the humanity principle. I think the other one, and Najat, you mentioned that, is really related to impartiality. That was always one of my favorites, and still is, humanitarian principle, which is to really look at really all the stakeholders and all the needs and all the people, and really have this approach of impartiality, which is such a critical one in the world of today, which is so polarized. I would say you can certainly mirror that with inclusion. I really think as one of the critical principle for peace will be inclusions. And what I mean by inclusion is a very thorough inclusions. Yes, it's about including all the stakeholders, including the one who are labelized as terrorists one day and maybe might be government tomorrow, but it's also including the population and the people. And that is maybe the biggest challenge we have right now in our commission, is not just to go at the formal power, not just to come to you, and we're very happy to discuss with you, but also to talk, how do we engage people? And here I'm not just talking about civil society, but really people. How do we do that? And I think there is here a big challenge to be able to do that. How do we reflect about culture? How do we bring, in fact, the informal dynamic of conflict preventions when you reflect about peace? So I think the inclusion element will be a central piece. And we can learn from the way humanitarian have done, or maybe not done well always, when it comes to, in fact, impartiality. There is really something here which is very powerful. The other one is, of course, related to, in fact, what I would call responsible leadership. I think there is a lot about that, and accountability. There would be no peace without accountability. We know it, but I think it's critical to put that straight. If we want to be able to do that, you have to have a leadership which is responsible. You have to have a leadership who understands also that when we talk about peace process, we are not just talking about political process, really not. It's something which is wider, much more inclusive. It's not just about making sure that we have a political dynamic. No, it's a much more wide around that. And I think there is really something around responsible leadership, accountability, inclusions, which most likely are principles that can really resonate and can somewhat be yeah, we can learn, let's say, from what have been done by the development and humanitarian actors. So that was just my contributions. Really willing to listen to you, and I have the feeling that the time is ripe. We need to test to be able to do that, and we really need to find solutions in the coming months or years. Because what worries me the most is the fact that when you discuss with young people across the board, people feel that peace is somewhat almost something that is naive to believe about it. How would you achieve peace, you know? And I really would like to be able to break this taboo, that we feel the same energy that we start to feel around the world around climate crisis, that we can somewhat capture when it comes to peace. I think we need to push. It needs to be at top of the agenda, and not just an agenda that is perceived as a very political, out of touch, and somewhat very cynical agenda. And this is something that we absolutely need to be able to move beyond, in fact, the formal actors that are, in fact, around this table today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a million, Yves, and thanks also for already highlighting a number of areas where there are potential synergies, and thanks for reinforcing, of course, the points of humanity, impartiality, and adding that critical point around inclusion, and again, emphasizing the great points that Najat also highlighted around really being people-centered throughout the different forums. I want actually, because this is meant to be a dialogue, so I perhaps in reaction to the points that you've raised, Yves, I will turn perhaps at a later point during the dialogue to Ramesh to also get your reactions, Ramesh, to the suggestions and the proposals and the comments that Yves has just raised. And also encourage, colleagues that are online, please feel free to make contributions in the chat box. This is really a great opportunity to be part of the discussion. But before turning back to Bert on, again, the initial question that I asked, and also hopefully more comments and questions will come from the participants, I'd like to turn to Hiba, again, and colleagues. Hiba is the head of the Secretariat for the Peace for Principles Initiative. And having launched this initiative in December 2020, Hiba, could you tell us more about where the Principles for Peace process is now in terms of mobilization, momentum, and process, and what are the future avenues for engagement, in particular for humanitarian actors? I know this is the beginning of, I hope, other opportunities for consultation and for engagement. So it'd be great to also share with colleagues online what are the other opportunities to engage in this dialogue. Over to you, please, Hiba.
Thank you very much, Mirvat, and it's really a pleasure to hear all the panelists, and look forward to the dialogue and comments from the participants. To answer your question, we've launched really the initiative in December. So we've been just under a year now, for the past 8-9 months, have been operational with the support of the governments of Denmark, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands since the beginning of the year. And the International Commission have been spearheading a global collective effort. And since we've launched, actually, we feel very pleased that over 120 organizations have joined the initiative to support the efforts of the Commission. And these organizations are from the Peace Caucus, some humanitarian organizations, some UN organizations, global, local. So I think there's a lot of positivity that we sense with this level of engagement and momentum, which is evident also in an increasing number of member states, regional organizations, and policymakers, and some traditional and non-traditional actors who are interested to engage. So this is the good news, and I believe the momentum and engagement that we're witnessing so far in the initiative is really founded in what gave impetus to the initiative in the first place. And I think I can summarize it in a couple of points. The first one is a common sense of fatigue with the repeated failures of peace processes and the current approach to peace and stabilization. And I think we've heard a lot of examples. Najat give us a very strong set of examples, but also Ramesh, Bert, and Yves. And I think Afghanistan is in our memory, in our mind right now. And I think Mali is a very, very big example where sometimes approaches are actually self-defeating. Undoubtedly, I think we are at a stage where there's growing recognition in the sector that our current approach is clearly not fit for purpose, that the nature of conflict has been changing, which we've been talking about now. We see it in the recurrence of conflict, we see it in the duration, in the parties who are involved, in non-state armed actors, and just the fact that in the past 8 years, there were more of them that have emerged than in the last 8 decades. In the fact that the era of comprehensive peace agreements have been long finished. I mean, we can talk about the last one a few decades ago. But despite all of these changes, the peace and security architecture and the normative frameworks that are around it have not necessarily changed in the last 30 years or so. So in so many ways, there is this sense of urgency and imperative for action, which we're seeing. And I think that's part of the momentum that we are witnessing, that there is a need for a new frame of reference. And I believe for us, we're in the initiative, we're always looking at the humanitarians, because for so long, the humanitarians had a common compass. There has been a set of principles, a common frame of reference, which also, of course, get violated all the time, but it exists. And of course, on the other hand, there's the Geneva Convention, which guide conduct of state in time of war. But the Peace Caucus have not had that common compass. They do not necessarily have a point of reference, a set of standards. So what we are really after in the Principles for Peace initiative is to come up with principles for peace that would guide decision makers as they are in situation rooms, that it becomes part of the calculus as they are making decisions, whether around intervention or around policy, and also that would create some tool to call for responsible leadership and accountability, and to create this bottom-up pressure. And of course, we recognize that this is a colossal objective that we're pursuing, and that this is a process of norm development and norm diffusion. So as both Even and Bert mentioned, we're really looking at the questions of incentives and shifts in behaviors and decision-making. So we have 3 pillars or anchors for the initiative, which also will give you a sense of opportunities for engagement for the various partners and actors who are also online with us. The first anchor of the initiative is really inclusion. It's really around bringing broad participation and real society perspectives. And for that, this is one of the key anchors for the International Commission and the findings from this process. So we've launched the global consultative process. We've done so far 86 consultations in 10 countries. There are 13 more countries that are planned. And the idea behind these consultations is really to bring real society perspectives and expectations and aspirations, and debunk, frankly, some of the assumptions which are really in so many ways dominating the peace building culture around what drives violence, how do you build peace, and what peace should deliver, which often are really detached from how, if you ask, and as someone who grew up in a crisis country myself, it's surreal for me to hear sometimes these assumptions, which are quite far from what, if you ask people on the ground, what do they think, what do they identify as their priorities. And so far, we've launched a lot of our partners in the stakeholder platform have supported this effort, but there are a lot more consultations that we're planning to do. We're also doing these with constituencies, with youth, with traditional and religious leaders. We're just starting now the line of effort engaging with 52 parliaments in partnership with IPU. So we will have consultations with 52 parliaments. We're also launching a line of effort in engaging with non-state armed actors and traditional and religious leaders. So there are many of these consultations planned over the coming months. And we always very welcome more partnerships so we can actually reach more people. The second pillar that we are also after is evidence. And this is really one of the key anchors and foundations of the work of the Commission, because we need to have also the scholarly rigor as we're trying to shift behavior. But what we are after is not only an academic exercise of just looking at what works and what not works, but actually bring in the practice and some of the practical and operational considerations. And we've been right now engaging with so many renowned global institutes, and with the support of Germany, we're also able to create a research committee who are backing the effort of the Commission. But what we're looking at are practical dilemmas. So we're not, engaging just in an academic exercise. And the third anchor is politics. And this is the hardest one because this line of effort that we're engaging in is really to understand and address the incentives and what's behind the calculus of decision makers. And I think we've talked about this to a certain degree right now, that realpolitik considerations are often what drive the focus on elite bargains and the heavy securitized approach that we see with stabilizations. And we can talk a lot about Afghanistan and Mali as two examples that we're living currently. But often these approaches are at odds with the aspirations of the populations or desire for change, or what they define as a legitimate peace, that it's more than political peace. And this is really coming from the country consultations. While we have a strong focus on political peace, what is coming from the country consultations is a much broader definition of what peace and what peace should deliver in terms of both its social foundations and economic foundation. So in a way, the approach of the Commission and the initiative is really principled pragmatism, combining both realpolitik considerations, but also real society perspectives and aspirations, as we move also from like this either or logic, as if, you know, and I think Najat, you talked about this in terms of the silos at times, when, you know, the political imperative versus the humanitarian imperative. It does not have to be an either or logic. For a person in Gaza or a person in Afghanistan, it's not Monday humanitarian, Tuesday stabilization, Wednesday development. It's much more complex than that. So actually what we're looking at is moving beyond polarities and either or logic towards how do we actually reconcile the short term while laying the foundations for the long term. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities for that. So Bert mentioned some of our thematic lines of engagement. I realize I've taken a lot of time, so I'm not going to say them, but my colleagues will write them in the chat. Each one of these thematic lines of engagement are an opportunity to bring both practitioners, scholars, local, international organizations, and real society perspectives. And we have many consultations happening. So we invite you to contribute and share and inform this process. And as Secretariat, we are in a way the operational arm of the Commission and their curator of content and of alliances around their effort. So please do reach out to us. And I would just also like to thank you, Mirvat, and also the IASC for your active engagement with the stakeholder platform. We very much appreciate that. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Hiba, and I will take your invitation for colleagues to engage actively in the consultations, and I'm glad to know that there are many more consultations that are in the pipeline. And yes, if colleagues can share how they can engage in the chat box, that would be absolutely welcome and would be extremely useful. So colleagues, I'm not seeing many comments or questions in the chat box, and I suspect this is partly because this is obviously a terrain or an area that, you know, as you pointed, as humanitarians, we tend to be uncomfortable in talking across, you know, silos, but I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a dialogue, again, to reinforce again, Najat, the point that you mentioned. It doesn't have to be either or. So maybe just to keep the conversation flowing and encourage colleagues to take the chat box and share their thoughts, I'd like to turn perhaps again to Ramesh, and perhaps maybe responding, Ramesh, or reacting to some of the points that Eve had raised earlier around going beyond the humanitarian and peace mandates and trying to see issues from affected people's views and perspectives, and the need for peace actors to take a longer view to peace building, and how humanitarians can contribute to that. Any reactions, Ramesh, from your end?
Thanks very much, Mervat, and also wonderful to hear the presentation from all the colleagues on the panel, because I think it really is this is a really good food for thought. From our perspective, I think what we would like to, maybe the best thing to do is to look at a specific example. And I mean, I think Bert can probably relate to this much better than I can. Just before COVID set in, I visited Mopti in central Mali. And I was talking to a displaced population, different generations. You had children, grandparents, great-grandparents, in some cases, an 8-year-old woman. And so we were just speaking about, you know, what they'd gone through and why were they displaced and what they wanted. And she basically said, thank you very much for the shelter and the water, really appreciate it. But what we really need to do is to speak to the people who displaced us, because for generations, we worked, if we haven't collaborated, we worked in cooperation with them so that the herders knew, what the farmers' needs were and vice versa, and they collaborated through generations, even through drought periods. So she just wanted to know why they suddenly took up arms and attacked her. And I think where we failed was to establish a dialogue, because that was something clearly that they wanted. And I think we tend very, very often just to focus on those life-saving relief needs. So I think we need to find a way to. It's not an issue of capacity; it's an issue of capability. And how do you strengthen their capability within the humanitarian sector to have that broader view? And when you ask those questions, keeping that in mind, when you do ask those broader questions, you also have to realize that you are setting off a series of expectations, and you also need to be prepared for that. So, I also remember, Heba raised Gaza, for example, and I remember speaking to a Gaza fisherman saying, what can we do to help you increase your access to fishing limits? And he said, lift the occupation, I can take care of everything myself, and I can restore my dignity. So you have to, and that's an IHL issue as well. So you have to be able to prepare yourself to respond to some of these issues without creating too much expectation as well. So I think that's what we would like to do in OCHA. And this is, the sort of the route we're going down, and Martin sort of clearly laying out some of these processes in his initial interactions with the Taliban in Afghanistan, in just prior to that in Mekelle in Ethiopia as well, in Tigray. So I think we need to work this as a collective. So it goes beyond, as Yves said, it goes beyond the humanitarian. It goes to the peace actors. How do you bring the peace actors into this as well, and the development actors, because obviously a lot of this is rooted in development failure. So that's what I would suggest we start looking at, the types of questions that you ask as a collective group, while at the same time it's imperative that we maintain those humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality, because it'll come back and bite us if we ignore them. Because as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, we need to be the model for those principles, both in terms of in real action, but also in perception. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Ramesh. And I'm conscious of time, because I think we have a little over 15 minutes before we conclude this dialogue, and I'm hoping it's not the first or the beginning. It's definitely the first, but I hope it's not the end of the consultations and the dialogue with the Commission. But maybe I'd like to turn perhaps to Bert with a question from a colleague, Sarah from OCHA. Have you already thought about how to codify the principles for peace in a way comparable to humanitarian principles? What process is envisioned? So any thought on codifying the principles, and what is the process envisioned to do that? So perhaps this question is to Bert, and I'll follow that up with a question to Najat. So given that many of the humanitarian crises involve some peace process, in what ways can humanitarians contribute to peace? So if you can just share, Najat, with the rich experience that you have, of course, on the ground, practical, pragmatic ways in which humanitarians can contribute to peace, that would be greatly appreciated. So first, over to you, Bert.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you allow me just to say one word about Mali, since it was, I think, very correctly mentioned by my colleague from OCHA, and I think he was very right when he was talking about Gao. I think this specifically shows where we are at a failure right now. I mean, not the humanitarians or the politicians or the peacekeepers or the peace builders, but how we look at this issue. Look, we all realized, I think, that Mali was an extremely complex case with asymmetric threats, with bad governance in Bamako, with lots of complex issues that had to do with climate change and so on and so forth. But when it came to inclusivity, I think we were all faced with the most difficult question that was around. First, the whole peace process was related around people who had taken up the arms. So I think this, I mean, everybody mentioned that this afternoon. The issue is not only to look at short-term stabilization, but long-term peace building, and how do you do that? Of course, we had at the time to make the first peace agreement in Ouagadougou with, you know, especially some of the Tuareg forces in the north. But everybody realized that that was not the basic issue in Mali. Basic issue in Mali was bad governance in Bamako, and exclusivity. And I think what these persons reflected in your visits to Mopti was exactly this. And I think therefore this issue of political context is actually quite key, that was mentioned earlier this afternoon. First of all, regarding something we all talk about, but we don't really do it. It's around prevention and intelligence. Intelligence obviously is a very difficult word, both in the UN and in the humanitarian area, because we think it's all CIA and issues around secrecy and so on. But it is very key early on to see that the real problem would arise in mid-Mali and not only in northern Mali. And that at that time, we could have worked much more on that issue of inclusivity, of realizing that what was happening in mid-Mali would lead to conflict and militarization of conflict. And that sort of working on local ceasefires, but then not only with those who've taken up arms, but the local population. And I think this is possible, including with development and humanitarian agencies, would have been the priority, not the stabilization with only the people who took up weapons, but especially to look with an eye of prevention to the real needs of populations in the central region of Mali. And that brings us immediately to the question around these principles and the pen holders around mandates for peace operations. And therefore, it is so important to say that actually the humanitarian agenda is key. I did not see in the peace agreement more than sort of lip service, that the key real role of human protection and its accountability and the operationalization of that for those who signed was an obligation that was checked. And therefore, the whole humanitarian imperative became a very difficult one of negotiations, and sometimes more of an appendix than as a cornerstone of peace building. So I very much feel with this issue of Mopti that was just mentioned, there's much more to be said about it, but it builds on where we find in the principles of peace, the roadmap to where we would like to go, and brings me to the question, the second question. Obviously, they are around, but it's much too vague at this stage, pluralism, inclusivity, accountability, not just political peace, but, if you want social peace and those elements to be involved in this. But I think we could actually learn also from the humanitarian world on this, because principles are not, automatically adhered by, as we know. And especially in a time, and I'm very worried about that, I think we're all faced with the same dilemmas at the moment, where in terms of geopolitical rivalry and the regionalization of operations, where, those who intervened are willing to fight till the last Yemenite or to the last Syrian, without any view of where the humanitarian protection and mandate comes in. We really have to make sure that in terms of incentives and the way we define those principles, we get a real alliance of people and of organizations who are part of these new principles of peace building in each of the countries. And I think we need also your advice on this, where the humanitarian principles are still an inspiration. I think they are. And still, governments have to legitimize themselves, and missions have to legitimize themselves as to their impartiality and neutrality. These are still incredibly important concepts, as is human security. But we know that in principle, they are there, but in the implementation, they're not. And therefore, we need to work in a combination of principles, incentives, some element, I'm afraid, of naming and shaming, and ensuring that they're from the beginning on part of the definition of peace building exercises. Much more to be said about it, but just a few words on what was just been said.
Great. Many thanks, Bert. And I'm going to go straight actually back to Najat because I'm seeing a couple of questions also coming in. So maybe, Najat, perhaps two parts to the question. One is around, again, practical ideas, advice, suggestions on how humanitarians can contribute to peace on the ground. And also the question that just came in from a colleague from IFRC around the changing humanitarian landscape, and with more actors on the ground. And so what do you think, whether you think there is a need to reflect on and spell out what those principles mean, and how do we do it without losing the original purpose? So maybe over to you, Najat, and I know that you have to leave exactly in 10 minutes, so I'm taking advantage of getting you online first before we have to conclude. Over to you, please, Najat.
Thank you very much, Mirvat. It's a fascinating conversation, I have to say, really. I mean, and I think it's already starting actually finding this common square where we are all meeting together for the same objective. So we can already lead the way. There are three very concrete, actions we have taken as humanitarian in the different and complex environment where we obviously we have contributed to peace. The first one was in terms of protection, and because we were able actually to bring to the table those, I can give you a very concrete example. In Lebanon, there is a huge caseload of Syrian refugees, for example. And obviously, there is a lot of scapegoating, there is a lot of instrumentalization. And as humanitarian, actually, one of our approach is really tension monitoring. This tension monitoring and the outcomes of this tension monitoring actually is feeding into every single, activity or action to bring about more cohesion, to bring about less aid bias perception, to bring about, more equity and a do no harm. It's true that there is no conflict here in Lebanon, but I can assure you the tensions we have seen and the increase of those tensions are very important. So being able to monitor those tensions, whether in Lebanon or elsewhere, and being able actually to be a kind of early warning, because we are very much involved, because we are very close to the population, we see the signs, we see the triggers whenever it happens. So just because we have this capacity, this is definitely contributing to more stability, and in some cases really to avoid a violence and to avoid a very serious conflict. That is one. The second obvious reason, when you have different communities, especially in polarized countries, competing for scarce resources, that we know is a source of violence and is a source of conflict. And I can give you again a very simple example, the food security. If you have a village that is getting, food assistance versus another village who is not going to get food assistance because the government decided that they would not, because they are coming from an opposition or because they are from a different confession or from a different ethnic, as humanitarian, we will make sure that actually we are supporting based on needs and based on vulnerability, and definitely not based on location, geography, confession, or ethnic. So those are really very concrete examples where humanitarian are definitely contributing to peace and contributing to peace building. And the last point was, when the peace agreement was discussed in CAR, for example, in Central African Republic, I remember very well, they did not want actually to bring the issue of the IDPs, mainly because those IDPs were all coming from a tribe that was not liked you know, and when you are sitting with the non-state armed groups who actually were the root cause and the cause behind the displacement of this population, you cannot expect them actually to say, yes, of course, we are going to cover or to address their needs. So as humanitarian, where in my case, it was the triple hat, I was very, of course, very clear that there is absolutely no way that this is not brought to the table. And maybe only a humanitarian would do that. And I wish that in the future, it's not only a humanitarian who would do that. And that's why the humanitarian principles are so important. I don't think we should revise them, by the way. We should definitely not touch them. We should definitely not revise them. We should definitely not question them. Now, we need to navigate in a very, very difficult, complex environment we are operating in. I think if we call on those principles, if we call on our own values, you know, to stand for the people, and if we call on our good sense, you know, most of the time you find solution without questioning the humanitarian principles. And what I'm saying is that, on the contrary, I hope that the peace actors are going actually to learn from the humanitarian principles and to borrow from the humanitarian principles to make sure to get to a more sustainable, of course, peace agreement than the number of unsustainable peace agreements we have seen so far. Over.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Najat. And I know we have a few minutes before we conclude, and I want to give each panelist literally 1 minute max with final reflections, advice on how we can progress the conversation and the dialogue on the principles for peace. But perhaps just to recognize the comment from Frauke, talking about how we tend to jump to tracks on peace processes or peacekeeping, and a lot of peace building takes place at the local level. So rather than both constituencies investing more and more on sensitization and awareness raising, there's a lot that we can learn, as you pointed out, Najat, earlier, by listening more to local actors and people around how they navigate these tensions and resolve and find solutions to issues on the ground. So thanks, Frauke, for this comment. And before I completely conclude, I want to give perhaps the floor first to Yves, your final thoughts, reflections, very, very briefly, because we're going to finish up in 3 minutes. And then I'll turn to Bert, Najat, and then Heba. Over to you, Yves.
The key word is compass, and I really liked what Iba was saying before. I think what we're trying to do is a common language that doesn't oppose local actors and international actors, doesn't oppose peace actors and development actors or humanitarian, but that we do have a common language and we are somewhat able to connect with this language. I've lived through, and I still live through, the humanitarian principle. And as Najat mentioned, it's not about doing it again and creating awareness. It's to show that we're able to live them and to be accountable toward them. And right, we will be held accountable by the people, right? I think it's critical. So we need to find somewhat for the principle for peace, the same level, if you want, of granularity, but also pragmatism and being clear about that. So that will serve really as a compass, and it should work for all the actors really involved. Thank you.
Excellent, brief, concise, and a good way to conclude. Over actually first to Najat before we lose her. Over to you, Najat, please.
Yeah, well, I have very little to add. You know, I mean, I think the best conclusion I can have is really the people, they need all of us. They need us to come up with a common narrative, as Eve was just saying, and that should really guide us in actually doing the best for the people who are suffering the most. Over.
Fantastic. And over to Bert, please. Oh, Bert?
We can't hear you, Bert. We've lost you, audio.
Okay. Perhaps, Heba, while Bert sorts out the connection, over to you first.
Thanks, Mervat. And really, again, thank you and the IASC and OCHA and the colleagues for facilitating this dialogue. I think I'm not going to compliment more, but to say I think there's a need for continued dialogue around this and exchange. There's a lot of space to build and learn from the experience of the humanitarians, but really to build on these opportunities of synergies that we've identified. So really just to hope that we will continue this dialogue and hopefully take it also to the country level, because we're very keen to have more of these discussions happening at the country level with very concrete look at specific contexts. So this is just, again, an invitation to continue engagement and to broaden the engagement, and anyone online who's been listening to us today to reach out, and we would love to build and engage with you. But thanks, Mirvat.
Thank you so much to you, Hiba, and thanks for making this possible. It wouldn't have been possible without you, really. So maybe back again to Bert. I hope you're able to get through this time. Bert, okay, apparently, so not the best connection. Time to lose the connection, but Bert, I'm sure there'll be other opportunities to hear from you. Huge thanks to all of our panelists. Really quite an interesting discussion. I will take also your invitation, Hiba. This is not the end of this dialogue. We have to continue, and we will definitely be in touch to figure out other ways and avenues to make sure that we support the work of the Commission and your work also with the Secretariat, Hiba. So thank you so much again for this rich discussion, and to many more, inshallah, in the next few weeks and months. All the best, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.